Hello everyone, this is Alkadron coming to you. I am recording my first ever Pauper EDH deck tech. The first one's going to be with my boy Azra Oddsmaker. She is one of my favorite creatures in this entire game. Let's get right into it. Let's take a look at what she does. We have a Rakdos flavored 3/3 for 3 mana. So, decent body, pretty aggressive. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you can discard a card. If you do, you choose a creature. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, I draw 2 cards. She lets you gamble with your hand size on combat. She makes every one of your creatures a saboteur, and if it connects, you get to draw cards, but you have to pay for it. You discard the card first, that's placing your bet, and then if you win your bet and your creature gets through and deals damage, you draw 2 cards. I immediately, as soon as I read this card, I immediately knew that I wanted to build her, and I also pretty quickly realized that I wanted to take her in a direction that I think most people would not immediately assume. I think most people look at the Azra Oddsmaker and think, this would be a good deck to fill with really small, evasive creatures. Things that I know are going to get through. Your tormented souls and your changeling outcasts. These things that are just unblockable. So that you can guarantee you're always getting value off of her gambling ability. I wanted to go with a completely different direction with this. She is about gambling, and I am about gambling, and I want to gamble. So, I've filled this deck with really small, aggressive creatures that just attack. Almost all of them cost 2 mana, and we'll go over them in more detail. There's a pile here. We'll get through them. Almost all of them cost 2 mana, so that I can have 1 out on turn 2, and I can start gambling and odds making as soon as I play her on turn 3. And all of them are really annoying to block. They're very easy to block. Like, you can block the Dwarven Berserker. He doesn't have any evasion. But if you block him, he gets +3 power and trample. So, he might still damage you anyway. You can block Thrillkill Assassin, but she has Death Touch. You're going to lose a creature for it. You can block this guy. He also tramples. And he's got 3 power. So, I wanted to make all of these creatures really blockable, so that this really was a gamble. And I wanted to make this gamble about, do I have the combat trick? I will attack with my Goblin. I'll discard a card to bet on Goblin Death Raiders, and I will attack into your 4/4 blocker. The gamble isn't, can I send an unblockable creature so I can draw 2 cards? The gamble is, do I have a combat trick in my hand that's going to make my Goblin Death Raiders big enough to kill your 4/4, and I'll draw 2 cards? I love making people make these really difficult decisions, trying to figure out whether I'm bluffing, or if I have the combat trick, or if this is just a terrible plan. So, that's what's fun for me about this deck. Let's talk about some details. You've already seen the Dwarven Berserker, the Goblin Death Raiders. Let's also talk about a Sun-Collared Raptor. These are fantastic creatures for the deck. Great place to start because they trample. And again, I want to send the little creatures into your blockers. Maybe you don't have the 4/4 blocker for the Death Raiders. Maybe you only have a 2/2. And like, whether or not I have a combat trick becomes kind of irrelevant. If you block, you're going to lose your creature, and I draw 2 cards. Maybe mine will die. Maybe I have the combat trick. Either way, it's kind of a terrible decision to have to make. This guy, he's only got 1 power, but he tramples. He pumps himself up. So, he's sort of his own combat trick. It's very difficult to profitably block this guy, especially when him getting through means I draw 2 cards. So, here's another trampler. This one's super fun for me because he sort of gets a bonus from the combat tricks I pull. So instead of brute strength, giving him +3/+3. It gives him +4/+3. So when I hit those combat tricks, even on other creatures, like if I attack with if I'm betting on the Dwarven Berserker and I also send the Fire Urchin, I can combat trick the Dwarven Berserker and get extra damage through the Fire Urchin. So there's lots of value here in a deck that's full of combat tricks, and he tramples. So that's just excellent. She doesn't trample, but she behaves a lot like the Fire Urchin. Scrying is not amazing in this deck, but scrying for free is always valuable. So she can stick around. Here's a couple creatures that start small and get big. Cutthroat. These guys first strike. Cutthroat and the Geopede are both 2-mana 1/1s. The Geopede turns into a 3/3 every time you play a land, which is not insignificant. A 2-mana, functionally 3/3 first strike. This becomes really hard to block in a hurry, especially when you know that I have combat tricks and I can just pump its power. So adding to this plan of forcing you to make forcing your opponents to make agonizing decisions about whether or not they should block these guys, just having first strike on the table to be able to say, if you block, mine's probably going to live anyway. Like it's so hard to trade with these guys. She doesn't have first strike. Oh, dethrone, this guy gets bigger whenever he attacks a player with the most life. So hopefully that doesn't stay me for very long because he can't attack me, but he should be at least a 2/2 or a 3/3 pretty easily, very early. The Neonate is a 2-mana 2/1. I really love this text. Attacks each turn if able. That's just a super fun ability in here because that, to me, that just adds to this gamble. Like if these are my only creatures and I bet on the Neonate, I discard my card to place my wager on the Neonate getting through, and I send the Neonate into your blocker. Am I doing that because I have to attack with her and I don't have a combat trick and I'm just expecting this thing to die? Or am I doing that because I have the combat trick and I would have attacked anyway? Like, you don't know. That's an extra layer of like psychological torment that I get to put you through. And I have another one of these, must attack each turn if able, with the Deathbellow Raider. So these are incredibly fun for me. The Deathbellow Raider is kind of the safer option. He attacks each turn if able, but he regenerates himself, which is outstanding. And he's just got a big butt. 2/3 is huge for a 2-mana creature. This card is super aggressive. The Neonate gets bigger every time she damages a player. So this is like an extra Saboteur ability. This is if she gets through, I'm going to draw 2 cards off the Oddsmaker, and she gets bigger, so that the next time she comes for you, it's going to be an even more difficult decision. Speaking of things getting bigger, we got an Immolating Soul Eater. This guy, Phyrexian Fire Breathes. For a Phyrexian mana, which you can pay with a red mana or 2 life, you can give this guy +1 power. This is really fun because of Double Strike. I'll talk more about Double Strike later, but this deck has a lot of Double Strike sort of combat tricks. And the wild thing you can do with the Soul Eater is, like, if someone lets it through, you can just spend 20 life to give it +10 power, and then Double Strike, and now they're taking 22 damage. It's like the card Hatred. It's fantastic. Even if you don't give it Double Strike, you can make it big and very threatening. This is another card that's just very difficult to block profitably. Or if you block it, I'm probably just going to pay some life to kill your creature, and if you don't block it, you're going to take a ton of damage. Speaking of things getting bigger, we got some rats. Rats I really like because they're, as a 2/2 for 2, they're just a body, but like the Sun-Collared Raptor, they sort of have their own built-in combat trick. You can monstrous them at instant speed if you've got the 5 mana up, and just turn them into a 5/5 with Menace. So they become even more difficult to block late game. But even if you're just using them as a 2/2 for 2, Just threatening the menace on your attack phase, or just threatening the monstrous on your attack phase, is hard to deal with for a card that's so cheap. I do have one card that has evasion. This guy has shadow. I wanted to just have one in there. And he attacks each turn if able, so he kind of fits that theme of the Deathbellow Raider and the Blood Crazed Neonate. I like that. Order the Even Hand. Again, we have this first strike ability. Very difficult to deal with when you're trying to profitably block. This one actually first strikes and pumps its power, which I like. The pro-white is also just a huge bonus. You can't O-ring this guy. You can't Afterlife. There's a lot of white removal that this guy just dodges, and I'm into that. Because white is the worst. Thrill Kill Assassin we already talked about briefly. She has Death Touch. A 2-mana 2/3 with Death Touch is just hard to deal with. This is, I think, the only one of my beating squad that costs more than 2 mana, and it's got some minor evasion, and it gets me my dead 2 mana things back. Because sometimes I gamble on a thing and I'm bluffing and they get blocked and my creature just dies. My creatures die a lot in this deck. They're all very cheap and very small and very expendable, but being able to get them back on the body of something that flies and has some minor evasion is pretty important. Speaking of flying, this guy, Olivia's Dragoon, gets an honorable mention because this is the only card in the deck that provides me with an additional alternative discard outlet. Azra Oddsmaker gives you 1 discard per turn, and it's at the beginning of combat. You don't get to choose when that happens. It happens every time at the same place. You can probably guess, in a deck this focused on discarding things, one of the big themes here is going to be madness. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So there's a lot of madness stuff in here. And a fair number of the madness cards get much, much better when you can play them sort of at instant speed. Like as a surprise that no one sees coming. And the Oddsmaker doesn't let you do that. The Oddsmaker lets you play them at a very predetermined time when the stack is empty. Olivia's Dragoon lets you hit those madness surprise effects at instant speed. So the other thing I need to talk about is Double Strike. These are my Double Strikey boys, and they are absurd in this deck. The Azra Oddsmaker lets you bet. You bet 1 card on your hand on whether your creature is going to get through, and if you win that bet, you draw 2 cards. But the way it's worded is you draw those 2 cards when the creature deals combat damage. If your creature is dealing combat damage twice, you get to draw 2 cards twice. This lets you, instead of betting 1 card for a potential 2, this lets you bet 1 card for a potential 4. And if you have these trampling combat tricks, the damage just adds up so fast, and drawing 4 cards is phenomenally good. So these are the guys, these are the only red commons that naturally double strike. We're running both of those, both 3 mana 2/1s. We got 4 instants that give double strike, or I guess 3 instants and a sorcery. Assault Strobe is the bad one. It gives the double strike at sorcery speed, so it's not a surprise. Not a combat trick, but it's still good enough to just be great. Psychotic Fury is the other kind of bad one. It can only target a multicolored creature, and there's only 2 of those in this deck. Azra Oddsmaker is one of them, so you can give the Oddsmaker double strike with the Psychotic Fury. The other one will come up later. So this one's very limited in what it can do. You have to be betting on the Oddsmaker to really take advantage of this, but it draws you a card when you play it, so it kind of replaces itself. As long as you have the Oddsmaker in play, this thing essentially like cycles for free. So there's that. These 2 are the good ones. Uncaged Fury gives something +1/+1 and double strike, so it makes it even bigger at instant speed. Temur Battle Rage will give the thing double strike, and if you control a power with 4 or greater, it gives it Trample. There's not a ton of creatures in this deck that naturally have 4 or more power, but there's a lot of combat tricks that can give things power, and that trample on the combat trick is what really makes this whole deck run. You want people to be afraid of blocking your creatures because you're going to pump them up and give them trample, and their creature's going to die, and you're going to get the cards anyway. And Temur Battle Rage is one of the best ways to do that, because you get double the cards from it. Speaking of trample, we got Run Amok, combat trick that gives +3/+3 in trample. We got Brute Strength, combat trick that gives +3/+1 in trample. We got Fury Charm, gives +1/+1 in trample, or it can destroy an artifact, or it can remove time counters. That one never happens. Mostly this is just there to give +1/+1 in trample, and in extreme emergencies it can destroy artifacts. So the suite of combat tricks is very, very focused on cards that grant trample. Because you don't just want to save your creatures. You want them big enough that they can put trample damage through and draw you those cards. We got some more trample and Rouse the Mob. This thing can potentially give lots of things trample, but at its basic, it's 1 mana for +2/+0 in trample. We got Barge In, which is 1 mana for +2/+2, and each non-human gains trample. There's only 2 humans in this deck, so that's pretty much everything. This one's nice because you can target a creature that you're not betting on. Like if you're betting on, if you're attacking with a couple creatures at a time, and the one that you bet on gets blocked, you can target a different creature to save the other creature with a +2/+2 while still giving the one that you bet on trample. So this one's versatile in certain situations. This one's very basic. 1 mana for +2/+1 in trample. So we have lots of ways to grant trample, and we have a couple creatures that just naturally have trample. And that's sort of the goal, making people really stress and sweat about whether or not we have this trample combat trick. So, as promised, another huge part of this deck is Madness. This is the quintessential Madness card. We have the actual casting cost, 4 mana, doesn't matter. You're never ever going to pay 4 mana for a Grave Scrabbler. Its Madness cost is 2, so we essentially have a 2 mana 2/2 here. When it comes into play, if its Madness cost was paid, which again, every time, you never cast this guy for 4, only ever for 2 with Madness, you can return a creature card from your graveyard to its owner's hand. So this is another recursion for our very cheap expendable creatures, and it's free real estate. Madness is in the deck that makes you discard cards as costs. Being able to just cast them instead with Madness is like, it's better than just ignoring the cost. It's turning the cost into an active advantage for you, which makes the value that this Oddsmaker generates so unreal. This is a Rakdos deck without any draw spells, and I'm routinely discarding to hand size at end of turn because I'm drawing so many cards off the Oddsmaker. I'll discard a Madness card to use her ability, I'll cast it instead, and then I'll draw 2 more. It gets out of hand in a big hurry. So let's see what other Madness things we got. We have a Gorgon Recluse. Again, looks like it costs 5, actually costs 2, which is, I guess, I can't understand how people thought that Madness would ever be like a drawback. Like, why doesn't the Madness cost be 5 as well? It's just, it's a 2 mana 2/4 with pseudo Death Touch. Here's a 2 mana 4/2 that people can counter by sacrificing a creature. It's not a great card, honestly, but it's very fun. Here's a 2 mana 4/1 that gets bigger anytime it damages a player. This is like that Blood Crazed Neonate. It's just a fantastic card. It's got enough power that you can sort of threaten to just give it trample and run someone over and draw cards off the Oddsmaker. And if you're threatening that and they let it through, it just gets bigger and bigger. It just snowballs out of control. And it has Madness. You can play it for 2 mana off the Oddsmaker. This is unreal. These guys all cost 3 on the Madness scale. This guy's just a 3/3 with no abilities, but again, it's just a free card. Here's a 3 mana 3/5. It's pretty much strictly better than the Weirded Vampire, but we take them both. Reckless Worm is one of my favorite cards in this entire deck. It is a 3 mana 4/4 Trampler in the deck that really, really loves Trample and getting through with its Trample damage and getting to cast spells for free off Madness because you're discarding them and getting them for a discount. These things that should cost 5 mana cost 3, and it just feels like cheating. We got some more Madness cards. We got Distemper of the Blood and Senseless Rage. In the continuing theme of Trample is good and Madness is good, Distemper of the Blood is good. This is one of those cards that I really, really like Olivia's Dragoon for. This card wants to be a combat trick. It's +2/+2 in Trample. You want to be able to do this at instant speed. It's a sorcery. You can still do it at instant speed if you're casting it off of the Dragoon. If you can discard it to the Dragoon to give something flying. Honestly, I don't even care about the flying. Like, that's mostly irrelevant. I would rather attack with this without flying and have it get blocked and then just be able to Madness in one of these guys at instant speed as a combat trick than try to give it evasion and have it not be blocked. So Madnessing in combat tricks is great. That's why the Dragoon gets a seat. These guys are the Madness combat tricks. +2/+2 in Trample on the sorcery and +2/+2 on the enchantment. This one sticks around. It's very good. If you can't cast these off the Dragoon, then you're casting them. It's not a surprise. So if you're just casting them off the Oddsmaker, then you're just getting them. Your opponents get to know what's happening before they choose their blockers. But they're still great cards. Even if you're just attacking with the Oddsmaker and giving it a Senseless Rage, you're just saying, here's a 5/5. Just super hard to deal with. Madness also has removal. Murderous Compulsion is one of my favorite designed cards. It's a sorcery that destroys tapped creatures. So, as written, it feels like the kind of thing that you're going to have to use on your turn. So if they play a big threat, you're going to have to wait until they attack with it, and then they get to finish attacking with it, and you take your damage or lose your creatures or whatever, and then later on your turn you can deal with it at sorcery speed. This is one of those cards where the Madness provides it to you at instant speed if you have a discard outlet that will let you do that. And again, in this deck, all we have is the Dragoon, but being able to destroy their creature after they declare it as attacker by Madnessing this thing in just feels good. That's not how it's going to get used mostly. Mostly we're going to just pitch it to the Oddsmaker and then cast it, just get free value out of it, casting it instead of having it be discarded. Same with these guys. Ickerslick. Ickerslick is another card I think that is just masterfully designed. The Madness cost on this one is more than its casting cost. But again, we have that you can Madness it at instant speed if you have the discard outlet. And my favorite thing about Ickerslick is that it is its own discard outlet. You can just cast it normally as a 3 mana sorcery that gives something -3/-3. Or you can cycle it at instant speed to give something, and then Madness it in for another 4 mana. So for 6 total mana, you basically get an instant speed version of Ickerslick that also draws you a card. Future Sight just delivered on these card designs over and over again. Dark Withering is a great Madness thing. This is destroying a non-black creature is not worth 4 mana, but destroying a non-black creature for 1 mana and dodging a discard effect is berserk good. Alchemist Greeting, again, not really worth 5 mana, but it's worth 2. It's worth 2 and not discarding a card. Fiery Temper is the poster child of Madness. 3 damage for 1 mana. Psychotic Haze is kind of a weird one. Pauper EDH doesn't have a lot of board wipes, and Psychotic Haze is not much of a board wipe, but sometimes you need to clear out a lot of little guys so that you can threaten their big stuff with your attackers. Sometimes Psychotic Haze kills some of your stuff, and you don't care. It's all very expendable anyway, but if your opponent has, for example, a lot of squirrel tokens from Chatter the Squirrel or something, you can clear them out. Makes blocking decisions much more difficult. Especially since even if you're not killing anything with Psychotic Haze, if you're just putting a damage on all their creatures and then attacking with something that might have Trample, you can get some good value out of this. And even if you're not getting any value out of it, it's free. You're discarding stuff anyway. Just get value out of the discard. This is the last Madness spell. Madness for 0 feels like a printing mistake that Wizards made, but I'm super prepared to take advantage of their mistake and their foolishness. Call to the Netherworld is unreal. It's free. It's just free. You don't have to pay mana for it. You barely have to pay a card for it because you would have been discarding anyway. You just get a creature back. This deck is going to be full of creatures in the graveyard. That's the end of the Madness. Madness adjacent cards for us include things like Flashback. So here's Trader's Clutch. I said that I didn't like Evasion, and I still don't, but I like Trader's Clutch. It gives something Shadow for a turn, and it is absolutely not worth 5 mana. No one is ever paying 5 mana for this effect under any circumstances. If you don't have the Madness card in your hand to discard to Azra Oddsmaker's effect, you can always just discard a Flashback spell, and then you have access to it later. It's like keeping it in your hand. It's completely dodging the downside of Azra Oddsmaker and just filling up your hand. Sometimes you really need that one turn of evasion to get through and end a game maybe. Crippling Fatigue is Flashback removal. Costs you 3 life, but you can give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn. Strangling Soot is Flashback removal. We're going to destroy small creatures. These guys, you don't always want to discard. Sometimes you just want to cast them, and then cast them a second time from your graveyard with Flashback. So they're very versatile in that respect. It's really easy to discard them and not feel bad, because you still have access to them. It's really easy to hold on to them and use them to kill creatures, and then kill more creatures. They're great cards. Firebolt and Fires of Undeath, I should say, are almost exactly the same card. They both deal 2 damage to any target. They both are pretty cheap to play the first time and cost a lot of mana on the Flashback. Firebolt is 1 and then 5. Fires is 3 and then 6. Fires costs more because it's an instant. Firebolt is a sorcery, but they're a great way to discourage blocking with small things, and dome someone in the head late game if you need that, put that last couple damage through. This is one of my favorite Flashback cards in this deck. In a deck full of Madness and Flashback that just loves discarding cards, Faithless Looting lets me discard cards, and I'm into that. And it draws me cards. This is a huge part of the reason that this deck ends up discarding to hand size, because of stuff like Faithless Looting. On the topic of Flashback, let's talk about First Sphere Gargantua. This ability is spelled like Unearth, but secretly it means Flashback. It is a quick way to get it out of your graveyard for 1 more beating with a 5/4 creature. So if you draw this late game and you want to spend 6 mana for a 5/4, great. It's huge value. It draws you a card. It replaces itself. It's fantastic. If you draw this early game and you want to use the Oddsmaker to pitch it into your graveyard, and then next turn you unearth it for 3 mana and attack. One of my favorite things about unearthed attacks is that there's basically no value in blocking it. If you unearth this thing, it is going to die. It is definitely going to get it exiled at the end of that turn no matter what. So there's trying to block it like spending creatures to try and kill it doesn't make any sense. It's gonna die anyway. You just pay the 5 life to make it go away. But in this deck, I'm gonna draw cards off that. It's so good. Making the decision whether to block this without an Oddsmaker is easy. You just don't block it. You take the 5 and then it goes away. Making the decision whether you want to sacrifice a creature, you want to throw a creature under this thing, under this bus, so that I don't draw 2 cards, while knowing that I might draw 2 cards anyway if I have a Trample combat trick in my hand. This is what this deck is all about. Just forcing you to make the worst decisions possible. Sierra Dragger is another one of my favorite designed Unearthed cards. Much like Ikerslick, it has cycling, and that is just super fun on a card that does things when it's in your graveyard. We don't usually cycle it, but it's an option. You can just pay 4 mana to have a 3/3 beater and not use any of its abilities. If you really need something like with haste, you can pay 2 to cycle it and then 2 to unearth it, and now you have a 3/3 beater with haste and a card in your hand. So that's very interesting. This might be my favorite unearthed card. My deck profits from discarding. Most other people's don't. So this is a great way to... You can just cast this guy on turn 2, force everyone to discard. I'll probably discard something with Flashback that benefits me later. And then on turn 3, I'll start odds making with it. I'll start betting on it getting through. And you're not going to block because I have these combat tricks. Or maybe you will block, and then it dies. And then I get to unearth it and make everyone discard again, while I get advantage from that discard. And then I'll bet on it getting through, because you're not going to block the thing with unearth when it might kill your creature. This is beautiful. One of the best cards in the deck, Rotting Rats. So disruptive. Ghoulcaller's Apprentice is really weird, sort of. It's not unearth. It's not called Embalm, but it's embalmed. This guy embalms himself. He's a great... He doesn't seem good. He seems very mediocre, but he has so much versatility in this deck, it's great. He's a 2 mana aggressive creature, and that's what this deck wants. It wants to be playing threats on turn 2 that attack. 2/2 is not bad for 2 mana. He's going to make you think about blocking him, because if you block him and he dies, I'll just get the 2/2 back. Alternatively, if you don't want to play him on turn 2 as your turn 2 attacky beater guy, you can pitch him to the Oddsmaker and then still get value out of him being in your graveyard with his Embalm ability. So this is a fantastic card in the deck, despite all appearances. That's it for the Flashback and Madness thing. We're almost done with this deck. We have to go through a couple more utility sort of effects. We already saw that a lot of the creatures in this deck have Trample naturally. So sometimes you don't have the Trample combat trick in your hand. What you have in your hand is instant speed removal. These function a lot like combat tricks if you're attacking with a Trampler. If I send a Goblin Death Raiders that I'm betting on, and you try to block it with your 3/3 or whatever, thinking that my Death Raiders will die and I won't draw any cards, I can just murder your 3/3, and then the Death Raiders tramples over because Trample is spectacular, and I still draw my cards and your creature is dead. It's great. So these are the instant speed removal. I only am running the 3 at instant speed because this deck is more focused on trampling combat tricks than it is on removal. You do need to have a nice removal suite though, because they're not just combat tricks for the Tramplers. They're great ways to deal with creatures that wouldn't otherwise block. Creatures that, like, if someone's commander is ruining the game and you know they're not going to block with it, you can just kill it, which is great. Other miscellaneous cards we have are Aftershock and Traitor's Blood. and I'm not sure why I put them both up there at once because they have nothing to do with each other. Traitorous Blood is a great way to make some people make some extra agonizing decisions. You can steal their biggest creature, you can give it Trample, then you can bet on it with your Oddsmaker, and then attack with it. And maybe they'll block with a couple of their other creatures to try and kill it and stop you from drawing cards. Probably they're not going to try and kill their own creature that they're going to get back at the end of this turn, and they'll just give you free cards for it. They'll take a beating from their biggest creature and give you cards, which is beautiful. It just feels good. And this is just the most versatile card we have at red in common. It kills artifacts or creatures. Sometimes it kills lands. I don't think I've ever seen it kill a land, but it can. I know people who play with decks that try to put a bunch of extra mana enchantments on a land to try and get crazy value out of untapping it. This will solve that problem. So super versatile, deals you 3 damage. I don't care. We're aggressive. We don't need that 3 life anyway. Last thing I need to talk about in this deck is the mana base. First, we have some cyclers. You've seen every other creature in this deck. The curve starts at 2 and ends at 3. That's it. That's everything. So there's not a lot of beef going on. Some of the guys that cost 3 are like Twins of Mauer Estate, the 3/5 with Madness. That's a pretty good body for only 3 mana, but most of the creatures in here are really small. These 3 provide some beef, some much needed beef on the back end. If you draw them late game, they're 6 drops and they behave like 6 drops. They're massive bodies, big threats. If you draw them early game, you can use them to fix your mana, and then probably pull them back in your hand for late game. I think all 3 of them are great. We got the Mountain Cycler that fire breathes, we got the Swamp Cycler that regenerates, and we have the Mountain or Swamp Cycler that is a 5/1 with haste. This is the other multicolored creature in the deck that you can target with Psychotic Haze? Psychotic Fury? The double strike thing that only affects multicolored creatures. Whatever that one's called. There we go, Psychotic Fury. So, if you want to give your 5/1 double strike, if it doesn't get blocked, you can dome someone for 10 and then draw 5 cards. 1 for the Fury, 4 for the Oddsmaker. 10 damage and drawing 5 cards in Pauper feels really good. I'm not going to lie. I've done that. It's a good time. The rest of the mana base, I put those 3 cards in the mana base because that's half the time that's what they're there for. The rest of the mana base is Renegade Map, is my only non-land mana related thing. I don't run any rocks in this deck because the deck is so focused on turn 2 drop a threat, turn 3 drop the Oddsmaker, turn 4 start casting your madness spells and dropping additional threats. All your threats cost 2 mana, so you should be able to cast some madness spells off the Oddsmaker and then drop more threats constantly as you hit 4, 5, 6 mana. You should be playing 3, 4 cards a turn easy in a deck with this low curve and just constantly a full hand. So I don't need rocks. This deck is going to draw enough cards that it's going to hit land drop number 5, 6, 7 easy. I don't need the ramp because this process starts on turn 2 and 3. Renegade Map is the one card I have in here for fixing because it drops on turn 1. None of these threats that I've shown you, none of these creatures in this pile, none of them cost 1 mana. Turn 1 of this deck is dedicated to fixing your mana, which you can do with this Renegade Map. You play it on turn 1 and it comes in tapped, and that's fine. And then you can sacrifice it to search for a basic land and put it in your hand. So on your second turn you can use it. It'll fix your mana. You can play your 2-drop. On your turn 3 you can play your Oddsmaker. These are the other cards that do that. If your turn 1 land is Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse. Again, on turn 1 you play these guys, you use them to fix your mana, and it comes in tapped, and that's fine. And then on turn 2 and 3 you proceed with Plan Aggression. These also fix your mana turn 1, comes in tapped, taps for either. This you can basic land cycle into whichever color you need on turn 1. This we'll put in this pile as well. Turn 1 comes into play tapped, fixes your mana. So all of the like exciting mana things in here are all about turn 1 fixing, so that turn 2 and 3 you're all set to go with the aggression plan. You don't need rocks, you don't need ramp. This is the only fixing that doesn't come in tapped. That's just a good card, probably should be in anything. The rest is all basics. This deck runs 36 total lands, which probably feels like a lot for a deck like this that draws as much as it does and fixes as much as it does. But you really want to be hitting all those land drops throughout the game, and honestly, having extra lands in your hand isn't a problem. You can just filter them into anything you want. You can, if you don't have the madness or the flashback that benefits you from discarding it, you can just pitch the extra lands. It's not a problem. And the stability of being able to pitch the extra lands or the stability of having this many helps you be really, really consistent about that turn 2 aggressive creature, turn 3 Oddsmaker, start betting immediately. The consistency you get from that by running 36 lands and this fixing is definitely worth whatever opportunity cost you have from having 1 or 2 extra lands in the late game when you have things to do with those lands easily. That's the entire deck. Thanks for watching. We're at 42 minutes. That's the perfect number, so I'm going to just end this right here. Goodbye.